Tom and Lisa thought they had hit the jackpot when they found the house on Maple Street. After years of living in cramped apartments and dealing with noisy neighbors, the quiet suburban community of Pine Valley seemed like paradise. The lawns were perfect green carpets, the sidewalks were spotless, and every house looked like it belonged in a magazine. "This is it," Lisa whispered to her husband as they stood in front of the cream-colored colonial house with its red brick walkway. "This is where we start our new life." Tom nodded, already imagining weekend barbecues in the backyard and peaceful mornings on the front porch. They had both worked hard to get here. Tom spent his days tracking down dangerous criminals as an FBI agent, while Lisa worked for the U.S. Marshal Service, chasing fugitives across state lines. Their jobs were stressful and demanding, but they were good at what they did. Now, at 45 and 43 respectively, they were ready for a place where they could unwind and enjoy the fruits of their labor. The real estate agent, a cheerful woman named Janet, walked them through the house one more time. "You're going to love this community," she gushed. "The homeowners association here really takes pride in maintaining property values. Everything is kept in perfect condition." Tom and Lisa exchanged glances. They actually appreciated order and structure. After dealing with chaos and unpredictability at work every day, the idea of a well-organized neighborhood sounded refreshing. "What exactly does the HOA do?" Lisa asked, flipping through a thick packet of rules and regulations. "Oh, just the usual stuff." Janet waved her hand dismissively, making sure everyone keeps their yards nice, houses painted the right colors, that sort of thing. Very reasonable people. The president, Mr. Patterson, has been running things smoothly for about 8 years now. The packet felt heavy in Lisa's hands, but she figured every HOA had their rules. How bad could it be? 3 weeks later, they were moving boxes into their new home. The neighbors seemed friendly enough, waving from their driveways and offering bottled water to the moving crew. Mrs. Chen from next door brought over a plate of homemade cookies and spent an hour chatting about the best local restaurants and shopping centers. "You picked a great street," she told them. "Very quiet, very safe. Just keep your grass cut short and your garbage cans out of sight and you'll be fine." Tom laughed. "Don't worry, we're pretty neat people." What they didn't know was that 3 houses down, Harold Patterson was watching their every move through his living room window. Harold had been the HOA president for 8 years, and in his mind, that made him the unofficial mayor of their little corner of suburbia. He took his role very seriously, perhaps too seriously. Harold was a retired insurance adjuster who had spent 40 years finding reasons to deny claims and spot inconsistencies in paperwork. Now at 62, he applied that same eagle-eyed attention to detail to every house, lawn, and mailbox in Pine Valley. He had a notebook where he recorded violations, a measuring tape that never left his car, and a camera phone that was always ready to document infractions. As he watched Tom and Lisa unpacking their government-issued vehicles, Harold felt a familiar twinge of suspicion. Federal agents meant authority figures, and Harold didn't like sharing authority with anyone. In his experience, people in law enforcement thought rules didn't apply to them. Well, they were about to learn that in Pine Valley his rules applied to everyone. The first few weeks passed peacefully. Tom and Lisa fell into a routine of morning coffee on their back deck before heading off to work. Tom's cases kept him busy, tracking financial criminals who thought they could outsmart the federal government, while Lisa spent her days coordinating with local police departments to apprehend fugitives who had jumped bail or escaped custody. Their jobs required them to travel occasionally, which meant their government cars, a plain black sedan for Tom and a dark blue SUV for Lisa, weren't always parked in their driveway. The neighbors had gotten used to seeing the official license plates, and most found it comforting to have federal agents living on their street. Harold, however, saw opportunity in their absences. It was on a Thursday morning in late September when Harold made his first move. Tom was in Detroit following up on a case, and Lisa had left early for a fugitive transport to Philadelphia. Harold waited until he was sure both cars were gone, then walked slowly down the sidewalk with his measuring tape and camera. He started with their mailbox, a standard black metal box that looked identical to everyone else's on the street. Harold measured the distance from the curb, the height from the ground, and even the angle at which it was positioned. He took photos from multiple angles, making careful notes in his little black book. Next, he examined their front yard. The grass was recently cut and edged. Their small flower bed was weeded and well-maintained. The walkway was swept clean. Harold frowned, disappointed that he couldn't find any obvious violations. But Harold Patterson didn't become HOA president by giving up easily. He walked around to the side of the house and spotted their garden hose, neatly coiled beside an outdoor water spigot. He pulled out his copy of the HOA regulations and flipped to page 14, section 7, subsection C. Garden equipment and hoses must not be visible from any public street or sidewalk, he read aloud to himself, then looked up at the hose. If someone walked to the very edge of the sidewalk and craned their neck to the right, they could just barely see a portion of the green hose behind a small bush. Harold smiled and snapped several photos. By the time Tom and Lisa returned home that evening, Harold had already typed up his first violation notice. He hand-delivered it himself, ringing their doorbell at exactly 7 o'clock. Mr. and Mrs. Carter? Harold stood on their front porch wearing a serious expression and carrying an official-looking clipboard. I'm Harold Patterson, HOA president. I need to discuss some violations with you. Lisa answered the door, still wearing her work clothes. She'd had a long day dealing with a particularly difficult fugitive transport, and the last thing she wanted was unexpected visitors. Violations? She asked, confused. Harold handed her a typed letter on official HOA letterhead. Your mailbox is positioned 2.3 inches too far from the curb, which violates Section 12 of our community standards. Additionally, your garden hose is visible from the public sidewalk, which violates Section 14, subsection 7, Part C. Lisa stared at the letter, then looked at their mailbox. It was positioned exactly where the previous owners had left it, and exactly where the installation company had put it 3 weeks ago. I'm sorry, but are you sure about these measurements? She asked politely. We used the same contractor that several of our neighbors recommended. Harold's jaw tightened. In 8 years as HOA president, very few people had questioned his authority, and certainly not on their first violation. I take very precise measurements. Mrs. Carter, I've been doing this for a long time. His voice carried a sharp edge that hadn't been there moments before. Tom appeared behind his wife, reading the violation notice over her shoulder. What's the fine for these violations? $50 for the mailbox, $25 for the hose, Harold replied curtly. Payable within 10 days or additional penalties may apply. After Harold left, Tom and Lisa sat at their kitchen table staring at the violation notice. $75 for a garden hose and a mailbox that's supposedly 2 inches off? Lisa shook her head. This seems a bit excessive. Tom was already pulling up the HOA regulations on his laptop. Let me see what we signed up for. As they read through the dense legal language and seemingly endless list of rules, they began to realize that their dream neighborhood might not be as perfect as they had thought. What they couldn't know was that this was just the beginning of Harold Patterson's campaign to establish his authority, and that their law enforcement backgrounds had already marked them as targets in his mind. The peaceful suburban paradise they had hoped for was about to become a battlefield, with Harold holding all the weapons and making all the rules. Tom spent the weekend with his measuring tape, checking and double-checking their mailbox position. He measured from 3 different angles, compared it to their neighbors' mailboxes, and even looked up the original installation permits at the county office. Every measurement he took showed their mailbox was positioned exactly where it should be. This doesn't make sense, he told Lisa on Sunday morning as they sat on their back deck drinking coffee. I've measured this thing 15 times. It's exactly 18 inches from the curb, just like everyone else's. Lisa had been thinking about the violation notice all weekend too. In her line of work, she'd learned to spot inconsistencies and red flags, and something about Harold Patterson's approach felt off. You know what bothers me? She said, stirring her coffee thoughtfully. He was so quick to find violations. Most HOAs give new residents a grace period to settle in. And that thing about the garden hose being visible, you'd have to really look for it to even notice it. They decided to pay the fines anyway. $75 wasn't worth a fight, and they wanted to start fresh with their neighbors. Tom wrote the check Monday morning and dropped it off at Harold's house before heading to work. Harold answered the door in his bathrobe, clearly annoyed at being disturbed so early. Mr. Patterson, I wanted to get this to you right away, Tom said, handing over the envelope. We've moved the garden hose and we'll have someone come out to adjust the mailbox position. Harold took the envelope but didn't thank him. Instead, he looked Tom up and down with obvious disdain. Good. I hope this teaches you that we take our community standards seriously here. Some people think they can just move in and ignore the rules. Tom felt his jaw clench but kept his voice level. We're not trying to ignore anything. We just want to be good neighbors. We'll see about that, Harold muttered, already closing the door. 2 weeks passed quietly. Tom and Lisa settled into their routines, got to know more of their neighbors, and started to feel at home. Mrs. Chen invited them to a block party planned for the following month. The Johnsons across the street brought over vegetables from their garden. Even Mr. Rodriguez, the quiet elderly man who lived alone at the end of the block, started waving when he saw them. It was during this peaceful period that Lisa decided to attend her first HOA meeting. The monthly gathering was held in the community center, a small building near the neighborhood entrance. She arrived a few minutes early and was surprised to see only about 12 people in attendance out of nearly 60 homes in the community. Harold sat at the front of the room behind a folding table, looking very official with his stack of papers and gavel. He barely acknowledged Lisa when she walked in, but she could feel his eyes following her as she found a seat in the back row. The meeting started with Harold reading the minutes from the previous month, followed by a financial report that he rattled off so quickly Lisa couldn't follow the numbers. Then came the violation reports. We had 14 violations last month, Harold announced, consulting his notebook. Mostly the usual infractions. Grass too long, garbage cans left out past pickup time, unauthorized decorations. Lisa listened as he read through the list, noting that he never mentioned specific addresses or gave residents a chance to respond. It felt more like a prosecutor reading charges than a community meeting. When Harold opened the floor for questions, Lisa raised her hand. Yes, Harold's voice was noticeably cooler when he looked at her. I was wondering if you could explain the measurement standards for mailbox placement. My husband and I checked ours several times and it seems to match our neighbors' positions exactly. The room got quiet. A few residents turned to look at Lisa, then at Harold. Mrs. Chen, who was sitting 3 rows ahead, gave Lisa an encouraging nod. Harold's face started to redden. Are you questioning my measurements, Mrs. Carter? Not questioning, just trying to understand the process. As new residents, we want to make sure we're following all the guidelines correctly. I've been measuring mailboxes in this community for 8 years. Harold's voice rose slightly. I use professional-grade equipment and I follow the exact specifications outlined in our community charter. An older man in the front row raised his hand. Harold, while we're talking about mailboxes, could you check mine? I think the winter frost might have shifted it a bit. Harold shot him an annoyed look. If you think there's a problem, submit a request for inspection. But if you're already checking mailboxes for violations, couldn't you just... That's not how it works. George, Harold cut him off sharply. Lisa watched this exchange with growing interest. In her job, she'd learned to read people and situations quickly, and what she was seeing here looked a lot like someone who didn't like having their authority questioned. A woman in the middle of the room spoke up. I'm curious about the measurements too. My neighbor got a violation notice, but her mailbox looks identical to mine. Harold was clearly getting flustered. If people have specific concerns about their violations, they can schedule private meetings with me. This isn't the appropriate forum for... Actually, interrupted Mrs. Chen, isn't this exactly the right forum? This is a community meeting where we discuss community issues. Several other residents murmured agreement. Lisa could see Harold's discomfort growing by the minute. Furthermore, Mrs. Chen continued, I think it would be helpful if you could show us the measurement standards you're using. Some of us have been here for years and have never seen the actual specifications. Harold's face was now noticeably red. The specifications are clearly outlined in the community charter, which every homeowner received when they purchased their property. Yes, but the charter just says mailboxes should be appropriately positioned, said George from the front row. It doesn't give specific measurements. Lisa realized that several neighbors had clearly been thinking about this issue but hadn't spoken up before. Her simple question had opened the floodgates. Harold stood up abruptly, gathering his papers. I think that's enough questions for tonight. Meeting adjourned. But we haven't discussed the block party yet, Mrs. Chen protested. Next month, Harold snapped, already heading for the door. After Harold left, the remaining residents sat in stunned silence for a moment. Then George shook his head and chuckled. Well, that was interesting. I've never seen him get that rattled before. "He's been getting worse over the past couple of years," said the woman who had asked about her neighbor's mailbox. "More rigid, more confrontational. But tonight was something else." Mrs. Chen turned to Lisa. "I'm sorry your first meeting was so uncomfortable. They're not usually quite that tense." "Don't apologize," Lisa replied. "I learned a lot." As the group dispersed, several neighbors approached Lisa to introduce themselves properly and share their own experiences with Harold's increasingly strict enforcement. She learned that violation notices had increased dramatically over the past year, that Harold rarely gave warnings anymore, and that questioning his decisions was generally discouraged. "The thing is," confided Janet Morrison, who lived 2 streets over, "most of us just pay the fines and move on. It's easier than fighting with him. But maybe it's time someone stood up to his methods." Driving home that night, Lisa felt a familiar stirring that she recognized from her work cases. It was the feeling she got when something didn't add up, when someone was hiding information or abusing their position. Harold Patterson might think he was dealing with just another new resident who would quietly fall in line, but he had no idea that he'd just challenged someone who spent her professional life dealing with people who thought they were above the law. What Harold also didn't know was that his behavior at tonight's meeting had been noticed by more than just Lisa. Word would spread quickly through the neighborhood about his defensive reaction to simple questions, and residents who had been quietly accepting his authority would start asking questions of their own. The seeds of a much larger conflict had just been planted, and Harold Patterson had watered them himself. Harold Patterson didn't sleep well after that HOA meeting. He kept replaying the moment when Lisa Carter had questioned his authority in front of the other residents. The way George and Mrs. Chen had backed her up. The murmurs of agreement from people who had never dared challenge him before. By morning, Harold had decided that Tom and Lisa Carter were a problem that needed to be dealt with quickly and decisively. He'd seen this before. New residents who thought they could waltz into his perfectly organized community and start stirring up trouble. Well, they were about to learn that actions had consequences. Harold spent Tuesday morning reviewing every HOA rule and regulation, looking for opportunities. He drove slowly past the Carter house 3 times, taking photos from different angles. Their lawn was perfectly maintained, their driveway was clean, and their house looked immaculate. But Harold had 40 years of experience finding problems where others saw perfection. Wednesday morning brought the first retaliation. Tom was loading his car for work when Harold appeared at the end of their driveway, camera in hand. "Excuse me, Mr. Carter," Harold called out, his voice carrying an artificial politeness. "I need to document a violation." Tom looked around, confused. "What violation?" Harold pointed to their front door. "Your doormat. It's brown." "Yes, it's brown, so?" Harold consulted his clipboard with exaggerated importance. Section 19, subsection 4 clearly states that doormats must be black, navy blue, or dark green only. Brown is not an approved color. Tom stared at the man, wondering if this was some kind of joke. "It's a doormat, Mr. Patterson. A plain brown doormat that probably looks exactly like half the doormats in this neighborhood." "The color regulations apply to all residents equally," Harold replied, snapping photos of the offending mat. "You have 48 hours to replace it or face a $50 fine." As Harold walked away, Tom noticed Mrs. Chen watching from her window. She came outside a few minutes later, shaking her head. "I'm so sorry," she said quietly. "This is my fault. After the meeting the other night, I was telling people how proud I was that someone finally stood up to him." "I think he heard about it." "Don't apologize," Tom said. "You didn't do anything wrong." "Maybe not, but I've lived here for 12 years and I've never seen him target anyone like this before. Usually he picks on people randomly, but this feels personal." Tom was late for work, but he spent his lunch break driving around the neighborhood looking at doormats. He counted 17 brown doormats, including one that was exactly the same brand and color as theirs. None of those houses had violation notices. That evening, Tom and Lisa drove to 3 different stores before finding a navy blue doormat that met Harold's specifications. They were both frustrated but decided it wasn't worth fighting over. "Pick your battles," Lisa said as they pulled into their driveway. "This is annoying, but it's not the hill to die on." They should have known Harold was just getting started. Friday morning brought violation notice number 2. This time, Harold claimed their garden hose had been visible from the street for approximately 3 minutes, while Lisa was watering her flower bed the previous evening. 3 minutes? Lisa read the notice aloud, incredulous. He's timing me now? The fine was $25 with a note that repeated violations would result in increased penalties. Tom was furious. This is harassment, plain and simple. No one else gets timed while they're watering their plants. He's trying to intimidate us into backing down, Lisa said, her law enforcement training kicking in. The question is, how far is he willing to take this? They got their answer the following week. Harold's next move was brilliant in its pettiness. He began scheduling routine inspections of their property, but only when both of their cars were gone. He would walk around their house with his clipboard and camera, looking for violations while they were at work. Mrs. Chen called Lisa at work on Tuesday afternoon. I hate to bother you, but Harold's been at your house for about an hour. He's measuring things in your backyard. Lisa felt her blood pressure rising. Our backyard? That's not even visible from the street. I know, but he says he has the right to inspect any part of the property that might affect community standards. When Lisa got home that evening, she found a violation notice taped to her front door. Harold claimed their outdoor water spigot was improperly positioned and created an aesthetic disruption to the community's visual harmony. The fine was $75. Tom was working late that night, so Lisa called Mrs. Chen to ask if she'd seen Harold's inspection. Oh, honey, it was ridiculous, Mrs. Chen said. He spent 20 minutes measuring that water spigot from different angles. Then he took about 50 photos of it. But here's the thing. I watched him walk right past the Hendersons' backyard, and they have the exact same spigot in the exact same position. The Hendersons? They've lived here for 15 years. Harold's never given them a single violation notice. Lisa spent that evening researching HOA laws and regulations. What she found was disturbing. While Harold had the legal right to enforce community standards, the selective and retaliatory nature of his enforcement could potentially be challenged. But it would require documenting a pattern of discrimination and harassment. The harassment escalated again the following week. Harold issued a violation for their garbage cans, claiming they had been placed at the curb 14 minutes before the approved time. The fine was $50, with a note that their repeated violations were becoming a serious concern for community standards. 14 minutes? Tom was pacing around their kitchen, holding the latest notice. He's literally sitting in his car with a stopwatch watching our house. Lisa had reached her breaking point too, but her approach was more methodical. I think it's time we started documenting everything. Times, dates, photos, witnesses. If this goes to court, we'll need evidence. Court? Over garbage cans and garden hoses? Not over garbage cans, Lisa said quietly. Over harassment and selective enforcement. This isn't about HOA violations anymore, Tom. This is about a man who thinks he can abuse his power to intimidate people who challenge him. That weekend, Tom and Lisa began their own investigation. They walked through the neighborhood with a camera, documenting all the violations that Harold wasn't citing. Brown doormats on longtime residents' houses, garden hoses visible from the street, garbage cans that were obviously placed early but never ticketed. They also started talking to their neighbors more systematically. What they learned was eye-opening. Janet Morrison told them that Harold's violation notices had increased by 400% over the past 2 years, but only for newer residents and people who had questioned his decisions at meetings. George Williams revealed that he'd stopped attending HOA meetings because Harold had started targeting his house after he'd asked questions about the community budget. The Hendersons, who had lived there for 15 years, admitted they'd never received a single violation notice, despite having the same outdoor features that Harold was citing other residents for. Most disturbing of all, they learned that 3 families had actually moved away in the past year, citing Harold's harassment as the reason. He's systematically pushing out anyone who doesn't fall in line, Lisa told Tom on Sunday evening as they reviewed their notes. And the people who stay learn to keep their mouths shut. So what do we do? Lisa looked at her husband with the same determination she brought to tracking fugitives. We build a case. We document everything. And we show him that picking a fight with 2 federal agents was the biggest mistake he's ever made. What Lisa didn't know was that Harold was also documenting everything, building his own case for what he planned to be the ultimate intimidation tactic. He'd grown tired of the slow process of individual violations and fines. It was time to bring in reinforcements that would scare the Carters into submission once and for all. Harold had connections, and he was about to use them in a way that would cross lines he'd never crossed before. The breaking point came on a cold November morning when Tom and Lisa found an official-looking document taped to their front door. It wasn't another violation notice. This was something much more serious. The letterhead read "Property Line Notice" in bold red letters. Lisa's hands trembled slightly as she read the document aloud. Notice of intent to place a lien on the property located at 47 Maple Street for accumulated violations totaling $12,400. $12,000? Tom grabbed the paper, scanning the itemized list. Half of these violations are duplicates. Look, they're charging us for the same garden hose violation 3 different times. The document listed everything: the original mailbox and hose violations, the brown doormat, 16 separate instances of improper, garbage can placement, 11 landscape, maintenance infractions, and something called repeated aesthetic disruption fees that seemed to multiply the original fines by 3. This is insane, Lisa said, her voice tight with controlled anger. He's making up charges. Some of these violations are dated for days when we weren't even home. Tom was already on his phone calling their lawyer friend, David Chen, Mrs. Chen's son who practiced real estate law in the city. After explaining the situation, Tom put the phone on speaker. A $12,000 lien for HOA violations? David's voice carried disbelief. That seems extremely excessive. Most HOA liens I see are for unpaid dues or major structural violations, not garbage can timing. Can he actually do this? Lisa asked. Legally, yes, if the violations are legitimate and proper procedures were followed. But the amount raises red flags. I'd need to review your HOA bylaws and the documentation for each violation. This could be grounds for a harassment lawsuit if we can prove selective enforcement. After hanging up, Tom and Lisa sat in their kitchen staring at the lien notice. $12,000 was a substantial amount, but it wasn't the money that bothered them most. It was the principle. Harold was essentially trying to force them out of their own home. We need to fight this, Lisa said firmly. Not just for us, but for every neighbor who's been afraid to speak up. That afternoon, Lisa took a personal day from work to investigate Harold's claims more thoroughly. She started by visiting the county courthouse to research HOA lien procedures and Harold's past actions. What she discovered was shocking. In the past 3 years, Harold had filed liens against 7 different properties in their neighborhood. All 7 families had ended up selling their homes and moving away rather than fight the charges. Harold's success rate in forcing out problem residents was 100%. Lisa also discovered that Harold's brother-in-law worked for a local property management company that specialized in buying distressed properties at below-market prices. 3 of the 7 properties that had been liened were purchased by companies connected to Harold's family. He's not just harassing people, Lisa told Tom that evening. He's running a scam. He targets families who challenge him, piles on bogus violations until they can't afford to fight anymore. Then his relatives buy their houses cheap. Tom felt sick. How is he getting away with this? Because most people don't know how to fight back and lawyers are expensive. By the time families realize what's happening, they're already in too deep. Lisa spent the next week documenting everything. She photographed every brown doormat, visible garden hose, and improperly positioned garbage can in the neighborhood. She timed how long other residents left their trash cans out after pickup. She even borrowed Mrs. Chen's security camera footage showing that Harold had been falsifying violation times. The evidence was overwhelming. Harold was selectively enforcing rules, creating violations that didn't exist, and using the HOA's legal authority to run a personal vendetta operation. But Lisa's investigation also revealed something else. Harold wasn't working alone. While reviewing public records, she discovered that the HOA's treasurer, a quiet man named Robert Walsh who rarely spoke at meetings, was Harold's cousin. Robert had been signing off on all the inflated fines and lien procedures without question. The HOA's secretary, Dorothy Franklin, was dating Harold's nephew and had been backdating violation notices to create false paper trails. It's a family operation, Lisa explained to Tom. Harold finds the targets. Dorothy creates the fake documentation and Robert makes it all look official. They've turned the entire HOA board into their personal collection agency. Tom was amazed by his wife's detective work, but also worried. If they're willing to commit fraud and file false liens, what else are they willing to do? His question was answered the next day when Lisa discovered someone had been going through their trash. She noticed footprints in the soft dirt beside their garbage cans and found several pieces of their mail scattered nearby. Their credit card statements and bank documents were missing. They're looking for financial information, Lisa realized. Probably trying to figure out how much money we have and whether we can afford to fight this. Tom installed security cameras that weekend, but the harassment continued in new ways. Their newspaper started disappearing. Their mail was delayed. Someone even called Tom's office claiming to be investigating financial irregularities in his background, though Tom's supervisor quickly determined the call was fake. The final straw came when Harold submitted a formal complaint to Lisa's supervisor at the U.S. Marshal's office, claiming she was using her federal position to intimidate local officials. The complaint was full of lies and easily disproven, but it still triggered an internal review that could have damaged Lisa's career. "He's not just trying to force us out of the house now," Lisa told Tom after meeting with her supervisor. "He's going after our jobs." That evening, Lisa and Tom made a decision that would change everything. They weren't going to be victim number 8. They were going to expose Harold's operation and make sure he couldn't hurt anyone else. Lisa used her law enforcement contacts to connect with a federal prosecutor who specialized in corruption cases. Tom reached out to investigative journalists who covered HOA fraud. They also hired David Chen to represent them legally and begin building a case for harassment and conspiracy. Most importantly, they started organizing their neighbors. Lisa called a meeting at Mrs. Chen's house, inviting everyone who had been targeted by Harold over the years. 12 families showed up, and their stories were remarkably similar. Sudden increases in violations after questioning Harold's authority, selective enforcement of rules, escalating fines for minor infractions, and always the threat of liens and forced sales. "We've all been fighting this alone," said Janet Morrison, who had received over $3,000 in fines for violations her neighbors never got cited for. "But together we might actually have a chance." George Williams, who had moved his elderly mother in with him after Harold started targeting her house with accessibility violations, was ready for war. "That man has terrorized this neighborhood long enough. It's time someone stood up to him." By the end of the meeting, they had formed a coalition of affected residents, pooled their documentation, and developed a plan to expose Harold's operation to authorities. What none of them knew was that Harold had been watching Mrs. Chen's house that night, photographing everyone who attended the meeting. He'd seen the formation of organized resistance to his authority, and he knew that standard HOA pressure tactics weren't going to work against this group. Harold Patterson was about to escalate to a level that would cross from harassment into criminal territory. He had connections beyond his family members on the HOA board, and he was planning to use them in a way that would either crush the resistance permanently or destroy his own carefully built empire. The war for Pine Valley was about to enter its most dangerous phase. Harold Patterson sat in his home office at midnight, staring at the photos he'd taken of the meeting at Mrs. Chen's house. 12 families who had banded together against him, led by those federal agents who thought they were so smart. This was no longer about HOA violations or even property liens. This was about his reputation, his authority, and his entire operation. For 3 years, Harold's system had worked perfectly. Find troublemakers, pile on violations, file liens, watch them sell and move away. Clean, legal, profitable. His family had made over $200,000 buying distressed properties cheap and flipping them. But Tom and Lisa Carter had ruined everything by actually fighting back and organizing the other residents. Harold picked up his phone and dialed a number he hadn't called in months. "Rick, it's Harold. I need a favor." Rick Morrison had been Harold's brother-in-law for 15 years, ever since marrying Harold's younger sister. Rick was also a former security guard who had been fired from 3 different jobs for being too aggressive with people. These days, he worked for a private security company that provided guards for shopping malls and office buildings. "What kind of favor?" Rick's voice was cautious. "Remember how you used to talk about wanting to be a real cop? Well, I might have a way for you to help with some police work." Harold's plan was simple in its audacity. If he couldn't intimidate the Carters through normal HOA channels, he would escalate to law enforcement intimidation. Rick had 2 friends at the security company, Danny Brooks and Mike Turner, who shared his fantasy of being real police officers. With the right uniforms and badges, They could show up at the Carter house, claim there had been complaints about HOA violations, and scare them into backing down. Harold had researched the idea carefully. There were dozens of websites where you could buy realistic police uniforms, badges, and equipment. As long as they didn't actually arrest anyone or seriously impersonate officers, it would be hard to prove they had broken any major laws. And if it worked, the Carter resistance would crumble overnight. "I don't know, Harold," Rick said after hearing the plan. "That sounds pretty risky." $2,500, Harold said quietly. Each for one night's work. There was a long pause. Rick had been struggling financially since his last job ended, and Harold knew that Danny and Mike were in similar situations. What exactly would we have to do? Harold laid out the details. Show up at the Carter house on a night when the husband was traveling for work. Flash badges. Claim they were investigating serious HOA violations that could result in criminal charges. Demand immediate payment of all outstanding fines. Act official and intimidating. Leave when the woman paid up or promised to stop organizing the neighbors. "We're not actually arresting anyone," Harold emphasized. "We're just encouraging compliance with community standards." Rick was quiet for another minute. "And you really think this will work?" "Rick, these people spend their days dealing with real criminals and dangerous situations. But when 3 police officers show up at their door over HOA violations, they'll be so confused and intimidated that they'll do whatever you tell them to." It took Harold 3 more phone calls and another week of planning, but Rick finally agreed. Danny and Mike were desperate enough for money that they signed on without much convincing. Harold ordered the uniforms online, picked up fake badges from a novelty shop downtown, and even bought a realistic-looking police radio from a surplus store. The plan was set for Tuesday night. Tom was scheduled to fly to Chicago for a case, leaving Lisa alone in the house. Harold had been tracking their travel schedules for weeks, noting when their government cars were absent from the driveway. Tuesday would be perfect. What Harold didn't know was that Lisa and Tom had been preparing for escalation too. The security cameras Tom had installed were recording everything, including Harold's late-night visits to photograph their house. Lisa had also started varying her routines, sometimes staying at hotels when Tom traveled, sometimes having Mrs. Chen or other neighbors stay over. Most importantly, Lisa had shared Harold's escalating behavior with her supervisor and colleagues. Federal agents took threats against law enforcement families seriously, and Lisa's office had quietly begun monitoring the situation. Tuesday morning arrived gray and cold. Tom left for the airport at 6 a.m., kissing Lisa goodbye and reminding her to call if anything unusual happened. "I'll be fine," Lisa assured him. "Mrs. Chen is coming over for dinner and I've got backup if I need it." But Mrs. Chen called at 4 p.m. to cancel. Her grandson had gotten sick at school, and she needed to pick him up and watch him for the evening. Lisa considered calling one of the other neighbors but decided against it. She was a federal agent who had faced down armed fugitives. She could handle one night alone in her own home. Harold received the text from Rick at 5 p.m. Target confirmed alone. Proceeding with plan at 8 p.m. Harold drove to a parking lot 3 blocks away to wait. If everything went according to plan, Rick and his friends would be in and out in 15 minutes. Lisa would be thoroughly intimidated, and the neighborhood resistance would collapse overnight. At 7:30, Rick, Danny, and Mike met in the Walmart parking lot 2 miles from Pine Valley. The uniforms Harold had ordered looked surprisingly authentic. Dark blue shirts and pants with official-looking patches, black tactical belts, and silver badges that gleamed under the parking lot lights. "Remember," Rick told his friends as they checked their appearance in the car mirrors, "we're investigating serious violations that could result in criminal charges. We need immediate payment or compliance. We stay calm, professional, and intimidating." Danny adjusted his fake badge nervously. "What if she asks for our badge numbers or wants to call the station?" "She won't," Rick said confidently. "Harold says she'll be so surprised and confused that she'll just do whatever we tell her to." Mike was having second thoughts. "I still think this is a bad idea. What if something goes wrong?" $7,500, Rick reminded him. "Split 3 ways, for 20 minutes of work." At exactly 8 p.m., an unmarked sedan pulled into the Carter driveway. 3 men in police uniforms got out and walked confidently to the front door. Harold, watching from his car 3 blocks away, smiled as he saw the scene unfold through his binoculars. Inside the house, Lisa was cleaning up after dinner when the doorbell rang. She looked through the window and saw 3 police officers standing on her porch. Her first thought was that something had happened to Tom, maybe an accident or an emergency at work. Lisa opened the door with immediate concern. "Officers, is everything okay? Is my husband all right?" Rick stepped forward, trying to project authority. "Ma'am, I'm Officer Johnson. We need to speak with you about some serious violations that have been reported." Lisa's concern immediately shifted to confusion. Police officers investigating HOA violations? That made no sense. In her line of work, she knew how law enforcement operated, and this felt wrong from the first word. "Violations?" she asked, studying the 3 men more carefully. "What kind of violations?" "HOA violations that have escalated to potential criminal charges," Danny said, reading from a script he'd written on his palm. "We need immediate resolution or we'll have to take further action." Lisa's training kicked in immediately. Something was very wrong with this situation. These men might be wearing police uniforms, but everything about their demeanor, their language, and their presence screamed fake. The confrontation that Harold had planned to intimidate Lisa into submission was about to become his worst nightmare. Lisa stood in her doorway, studying the 3 men in front of her with the keen eye of someone who had spent years evaluating threats and spotting deception. Everything about this situation felt wrong, but she needed to be absolutely certain before making any moves. "I'm sorry, could you repeat that?" Lisa asked, her voice carefully neutral. "You're here about HOA violations?" Rick shifted uncomfortably but pressed forward with his script. "Yes, ma'am. We've received multiple complaints about serious violations at this address. The situation has escalated beyond normal HOA procedures." Lisa noticed several things immediately. First, none of them had shown her proper identification. Real police officers always displayed their badges and credentials when introducing themselves. Second, their uniforms looked right from a distance, but up close she could see they were cheap replicas. The badges were too shiny. The patches were slightly crooked and the tactical belts were missing standard equipment. Most telling of all was their body language. These men were nervous, fidgeting, and avoiding direct eye contact. Real police officers conducting official business carried themselves with confidence and authority. These 3 looked like they were about to bolt at any second. "Which department are you officers with?" Lisa asked pleasantly, as if she was genuinely interested. Danny jumped in quickly. "Local police. We work with the HOA Enforcement Division." Lisa almost smiled. There was no such thing as an HOA Enforcement Division in any police department she knew of. Police didn't get involved in homeowner association disputes unless there were actual crimes involved. "That's interesting," Lisa said, stepping back slightly and positioning herself where she could quickly reach her service weapon if needed. "Could I see your badges and identification, please?" "I'd like to copy down your badge numbers for my records." The 3 men exchanged quick glances. This wasn't going according to Harold's plan at all. They had expected confusion, intimidation, and quick compliance. They hadn't prepared for someone who asked detailed questions and knew police procedures. Rick tried to regain control of the situation. "Ma'am, we don't have time for lengthy procedures. We need immediate resolution of these violations or we'll have to escalate this to criminal charges." "Criminal charges for HOA violations?" Lisa asked, raising an eyebrow. "What specific criminal statutes are we talking about?" Mike was starting to sweat despite the cool evening air. "Well, destruction of property values, community disruption." Lisa knew those weren't actual criminal charges, and any real police officer would know that too. Her suspicion was now certainty. These men were completely fake. "Gentlemen," Lisa said, her voice becoming more authoritative, "I'm going to need to see proper identification right now, or I'm going to have to ask you to leave my property." Danny stepped forward aggressively, trying to intimidate her. "Lady, you don't get to make demands here. We're conducting official police business and you need to cooperate." That was the moment Lisa decided to end this charade. She had given them multiple chances to identify themselves properly, and instead they had become more aggressive and threatening. Time to turn the tables. Lisa reached into her jacket with a smooth, practiced motion and pulled out her leather credential case. In one fluid movement, she flipped it open to reveal her U.S. Marshal badge and identification. "Gentlemen," she said, her voice now carrying the full authority of federal law enforcement, "I'm Deputy U.S. Marshal Lisa Carter, and I'm placing all 3 of you under citizen's arrest for impersonating police officers." The effect was immediate and dramatic. All three men went pale as they realized they had just tried to intimidate a federal agent. Rick's mouth fell open. Danny actually took a step backward. Mike looked like he was about to be sick. What? Rick stammered. You're really a cop? I'm a federal agent, Lisa corrected, pulling out her cell phone with her free hand while keeping her credentials visible. And impersonating a police officer is a felony in this state. You're looking at serious prison time. Danny was the first to panic. This is all a misunderstanding. We weren't trying to impersonate anyone. Really? Lisa's voice was ice cold. Then why are you wearing police uniforms and claiming to be conducting official police business? Why did you refuse to show proper identification? And why are you threatening me with criminal charges over HOA violations? Mike was frantically trying to remove his fake badge. Look, we can explain everything. This whole thing was someone else's idea. Whose idea? Lisa demanded. The three men looked at each other desperately. They hadn't planned for this scenario at all. Harold had assured them that Lisa would be too intimidated to ask questions, let alone reveal that she was a federal agent herself. Rick made a last desperate attempt to salvage the situation. We're private security officers working with the HOA on enforcement issues. Private security doesn't wear police uniforms or claim to be investigating criminal charges, Lisa replied. And they certainly don't threaten residents with arrest powers they don't have. Lisa was already dialing 911 while maintaining eye contact with the three men. She had memorized their faces, noted their approximate heights and weights, and was positioning herself to pursue if any of them tried to run. 1. What's your emergency? This is Deputy U.S. Marshal Lisa Carter. I need units at 47 Maple Street in Pine Valley immediately. I have 3 subjects in custody for impersonating police officers. The dispatcher recognized the seriousness of an officer requesting backup and immediately dispatched units. Danny was now openly panicking. Oh God, we're going to prison. I knew this was a stupid idea. Who put you up to this? Lisa asked again, more firmly this time. Rick was calculating whether he could make it to their car before Lisa could stop him. But looking at her stance and the way she carried herself, he realized she was probably armed and definitely trained. Running would only make things worse. It was Harold Patterson, Mike blurted out, unable to handle the pressure. He paid us to do this. He said it would just scare you into backing down from the HOA stuff. Harold Patterson? Lisa felt pieces clicking into place. The HOA president hired you to impersonate police officers? He said it wasn't really illegal, Danny added desperately. He said we were just helping with community enforcement. Lisa shook her head in amazement. Harold's desperation had led him to commit serious felonies. This was no longer harassment or HOA disputes. This was criminal conspiracy. In the distance, they could hear sirens approaching. Real police officers were coming, and the contrast between professional law enforcement and these 3 amateur criminals was about to become very obvious. Rick made one final attempt to escape consequences. Look, we'll just leave and never come back. No harm done, right? No harm done? Lisa's voice carried genuine anger now. You threatened a federal agent while impersonating police officers. You conspired to intimidate and harass residents. You've committed multiple felonies tonight. The sirens were getting closer. 3 police cars turned onto Maple Street with lights flashing, responding to an officer's call for backup. As the real police officers approached her front door, Lisa felt a sense of satisfaction. Harold Patterson had finally made a mistake big enough to destroy his entire operation. By escalating to criminal impersonation, he had given law enforcement everything they needed to shut him down permanently. The 3 fake officers stood frozen on her porch, knowing their amateur criminal careers were about to come to an end. In trying to intimidate one federal agent, they had triggered an investigation that would expose years of harassment, fraud, and conspiracy. Harold's empire was about to crumble, and it was all because he had underestimated the woman he thought he could intimidate into silence. The real police officers who responded to Lisa's call were a study in professional competence, compared to the 3 amateurs standing on her porch. Sergeant Williams led the response team, and within seconds of arriving, he could tell the difference between the federal agent and the fake officers. Deputy Carter, Sergeant Williams approached with his hand near his weapon, taking in the scene quickly. Are these the subjects? Yes, Sergeant. 3 males impersonating police officers, making threats related to HOA violations. They've admitted to being hired by Harold Patterson to intimidate me. The contrast was immediate and stark. Sergeant Williams and his officers moved with practiced efficiency. Their uniforms were genuine, their equipment was properly positioned, and their entire demeanor radiated real authority. The three fake officers looked like children playing dress-up next to actual law enforcement. "Gentlemen, I need you to place your hands behind your backs," Officer Martinez ordered Rick, Danny, and Mike. "You're under arrest for impersonating peace officers." Danny started crying. "Please, this was all a mistake. We didn't know she was really a cop." "That's exactly the problem," Sergeant Williams replied as he handcuffed Rick. "You were pretending to be something you're not. And that's a felony regardless of who you're trying to fool." As the three fake officers were loaded into patrol cars, Lisa provided her statement to the responding officers. She explained the months of harassment from Harold Patterson, the escalating violations and fines, and how this fake police incident was clearly an attempt to intimidate her into backing down from organizing the neighborhood. "We'll need you to come to the station tomorrow to give a full statement," Sergeant Williams told her. "This is obviously bigger than just these three guys. If Patterson hired them, we're looking at conspiracy charges." Lisa nodded. "I have documentation of everything. Photos, violation notices, financial records. Patterson's been running a systematic harassment campaign." After the police left with their prisoners, Lisa called Tom immediately. "You're not going to believe what just happened," she began, and spent the next 20 minutes explaining the entire incident. Tom was furious. "Are you okay? Are you safe?" "I'm fine. Better than fine, actually. Harold just handed us everything we need to destroy his operation." Lisa then called Mrs. Chen, who came over immediately despite the late hour. Word spread quickly through the neighborhood that something major had happened at the Carter house. By 10 p.m., half a dozen neighbors had gathered to hear the story. Fake police officers? George Williams shook his head in amazement. "Harold actually hired fake cops to intimidate you?" "It gets worse," Lisa explained. When they were arrested, one of them admitted that Harold has done this before. He's been using intimidation tactics on other residents for years. Janet Morrison was pale. "That explains so much. When I was fighting my violations last year, I swear someone was following me, and my mail was going missing too." Meanwhile, 3 blocks away, Harold Patterson was pacing his living room and checking his phone every 30 seconds. Rick was supposed to call by 8:30 to report that the mission was complete. It was now past 10 o'clock and Harold hadn't heard anything. Harold drove past the Carter house and felt his stomach drop. There were no cars in the driveway, the house was dark, and everything looked normal. Too normal. If Rick and his friends had successfully intimidated Lisa, there should have been signs of activity. Lights on, cars coming and going, maybe even moving trucks. Harold called Rick's phone, but it went straight to voicemail. Same with Danny and Mike. A cold dread started forming in Harold's chest. He drove to the Walmart parking lot where they had planned to meet, but found it empty except for a few late-night shoppers. Harold sat in his car for an hour, calling and texting, but getting no responses. Finally, Harold drove home and turned on the local news, hoping against hope that he wouldn't see what he was afraid he would see. The 11 o'clock news led with the story. 3 men arrested for impersonating police officers in Pine Valley. The reporter stood outside the police station, explaining that the suspects had been caught trying to intimidate a federal agent over HOA violations. Harold's world collapsed in that moment. Not only had his plan failed spectacularly, but Rick had probably told the police everything. Harold was about to become the target of a criminal investigation that would expose his entire operation. Harold's phone rang. It was his cousin Robert, the HOA treasurer. "Harold, what the hell is going on? I just saw the news. They're saying someone hired fake cops to harass that federal agent woman. Robert, we need to talk. Not on the phone. Are you insane? Did you really hire fake police officers?" Harold hung up and immediately started shredding documents. Financial records, violation reports, correspondence with his family members, anything that could connect him to years of harassment and fraud. But Harold was too late. At 11:30 p.m., Detective Sarah Rodriguez was already reviewing Rick Morrison's confession. Rick had given up everything: Harold's plan, the fake uniforms, the payment arrangements, and most damaging of all, details about previous intimidation campaigns against other residents. "This Patterson guy has been running a whole operation," Detective Rodriguez told her partner. According to Morrison, they've been systematically targeting residents who challenge the HOA, piling on fake violations and forcing them to sell their homes. That's racketeering, Detective Johnson replied. RICO charges. This is way bigger than just fake cops. By midnight, the police had obtained search warrants for Harold's house, Robert Walsh's financial records, and Dorothy Franklin's computer files. They had also contacted the FBI's white-collar crime division, since the scheme involved fraud, conspiracy, and civil rights violations. Lisa couldn't sleep that night, not because she was scared, but because she was energized. After months of harassment and intimidation, justice was finally moving forward. Harold had made the fatal mistake of escalating beyond civil disputes into serious criminal territory. At 6 a.m., Harold Patterson was awakened by loud knocking on his front door. He looked out his window and saw 4 police cars and what appeared to be federal agents. Harold Patterson, this is Detective Rodriguez with the Pine Valley Police Department. We have a warrant to search these premises. Harold's hands shook as he opened the door. The investigators pushed past him and began systematically searching his house, seizing computers, documents, and anything related to his HOA activities. Mr. Patterson, you're under arrest for conspiracy, fraud, and solicitation of criminal impersonation. Detective Rodriguez read him his rights as Harold stood in his bathrobe, watching years of careful planning crumble around him. As Harold was led away in handcuffs, Mrs. Chen and several other neighbors watched from their windows. Word was already spreading through Pine Valley that the reign of Harold Patterson was over. By 8 a.m., local news crews were setting up outside Harold's house. The story of the fake police incident had exploded overnight, and reporters were investigating the broader pattern of HOA harassment that had been exposed. Lisa received a call from her supervisor at 9 a.m. Carter, I've been following this situation with your HOA president. The Bureau wants to talk to you about testifying in a federal case. Sounds like this guy was running a serious conspiracy. I'll be there, Lisa replied, and I have about 12 neighbors who will want to testify too. Harold Patterson's empire had taken years to build, but it had collapsed in a single night. His decision to escalate to fake police officers had triggered an investigation that would expose everything and send him to prison for years. The man who had thought he could intimidate a federal agent had just learned the most expensive lesson of his life. 6 months later, Tom and Lisa Carter sat in their beautifully maintained backyard, enjoying a peaceful Saturday morning coffee while reading the newspaper. The front page story made Lisa smile. Former HOA president sentenced to 5 years in federal prison. The investigation that began with 3 fake police officers on their doorstep had uncovered a criminal conspiracy that shocked even seasoned federal prosecutors. Harold Patterson, along with his cousin Robert Walsh and girlfriend Dorothy Franklin, had been running what authorities called one of the most sophisticated HOA fraud schemes they had ever seen. The evidence was overwhelming. Harold's own meticulous record-keeping, which he had used to track violations and target residents, became the prosecution's best weapon against him. Federal investigators found detailed files on every family he had harassed, complete with financial information stolen from trash cans, surveillance photos, and notes about which residents could be intimidated most easily. Listen to this. Lisa read aloud to Tom. Patterson's scheme netted an estimated $400,000 over 3 years through fraudulent fines, forced property sales, and kickbacks from related property purchases. At least 18 families were driven from their homes through systematic harassment. Tom shook his head. 18 families. Can you imagine how many people's lives he disrupted? The newspaper article went on to detail how Harold's operation worked. He would target new residents or anyone who questioned his authority, then pile on fake violations until the fines became unbearable. His cousin Robert would approve the inflated charges without proper review, while Dorothy backdated documents and created false paper trails. When families couldn't pay or chose to fight the charges, Harold's relatives would swoop in to buy their homes at below-market prices. The fake police incident had been Harold's biggest mistake and his final downfall. Rick Morrison, facing serious felony charges, had cooperated fully with investigators and revealed years of intimidation tactics. Danny Brooks and Mike Turner, desperate to reduce their sentences, provided additional details about Harold's methods and other victims. The best part, Lisa continued reading, is that all the fines and liens have been declared invalid. The new HOA board is refunding money to affected families and has implemented transparency measures to prevent future abuse. The transformation of Pine Valley had been remarkable. After Harold's arrest, an emergency election replaced the entire HOA board with residents who had been victims of his harassment. Mrs. Chen was elected president, George Williams became treasurer, and Janet Morrison took over as secretary. The new board's first action was to hire an independent auditor to review all of Harold's violations and financial transactions. They discovered that most of the violations Harold had cited didn't actually exist in the HOA bylaws, and that thousands of dollars in fines had been collected illegally. Tom's phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Mrs. Chen. "Block party starting at 2 p.m. Hope you can make it." The block party had become a monthly tradition since Harold's arrest. What started as a celebration of their freedom from harassment had evolved into a genuine community gathering where neighbors actually got to know each other. "Should we go?" Tom asked. "Absolutely. I want to hear how the Rodriguez family is settling in." The Rodriguez family had moved into Harold's old house after it went up for sale. The irony wasn't lost on anyone that Harold's own home was now occupied by a family he would have targeted. Maria Rodriguez worked as a public defender, and her husband Carlos was a union organizer. Both were exactly the type of people Harold despised. At the block party, the contrast with Harold's reign was obvious. Children played freely on lawns without worrying about aesthetic violations. Neighbors chatted openly about their homes and projects without fear of being reported. Garden hoses lay visible, garbage cans stayed out an extra hour after pickup, and doormat colors ranged across the entire spectrum. "It's amazing how different this place feels," Janet Morrison told Lisa as they watched kids play in the street. "We were all so tense before, walking on eggshells, afraid to make any changes to our own homes." George Williams joined their conversation, holding a beer and grinning widely. "You know what I did last week? I planted roses in my front yard. Bright red roses." Harold would have had a stroke. The community had also learned valuable lessons about HOA governance and resident rights. Lisa had organized workshops where she explained how homeowners could protect themselves from future abuse, what questions to ask HOA board candidates, and how to recognize when enforcement becomes harassment. The key, Lisa explained to a group of newer residents, is transparency and accountability. Board meetings should be open, financial records should be available for review, and enforcement should be consistent and fair for everyone. Carlos Rodriguez raised his hand. "What if we see signs of the same problem starting again?" "Document everything," Tom answered. "Take photos, keep records, and don't be afraid to ask questions at board meetings. Most importantly, communicate with your neighbors." Harold's power came from isolating people and making them feel like they were fighting alone. As the afternoon wore on, Lisa reflected on how much their lives had changed. The stress and constant vigilance of Harold's harassment campaign had been replaced by genuine community involvement. She and Tom had made real friends among their neighbors, people they might never have gotten to know under Harold's system of fear and division. Mrs. Chen approached with a clipboard and a smile. "Lisa, we're organizing a letter of support for the Hendricks family. They're dealing with an abusive HOA president in the Westwood development. Would you be willing to share your experience with their situation?" Lisa didn't hesitate. "Of course. No one should have to go through what we went through." The Hendricks case was one of several that had emerged after Harold's story made national news. HOA abuse was apparently more common than most people realized, and Lisa and Tom had become unofficial advocates for families facing similar harassment. That evening, as the block party wound down and neighbors headed home, Tom and Lisa walked slowly back to their house. The same house that had once felt like a prison under Harold's surveillance now felt like a true home in a genuine community. "You know what's funny?" Tom said as they reached their front door. "That brown doormat that started all this trouble? It's still in our garage," Lisa laughed. "Maybe we should frame it." The doormat that brought down a criminal conspiracy. Inside their house, Lisa checked her email and found a message from Detective Rodriguez with the final update on the case. Rick Morrison had been sentenced to 18 months in prison. Danny Brooks and Mike Turner each received 1-year sentences. Dorothy Franklin got 2 years for her role in document fraud. Robert Walsh was sentenced to 3 years for financial conspiracy. Harold Patterson, as the mastermind of the operation, received the harshest sentence: 5 years in federal prison followed by 3 years of supervised probation. He was also ordered to pay full restitution to all affected families, though investigators doubted he had enough assets left to cover the damages. The article mentioned that Harold's sister had visited him in prison once, then never returned. His elaborate scheme had cost him not just his freedom and money, but his family relationships and reputation in the community, where he had lived for decades. As Lisa turned off her computer and prepared for bed, she felt a deep sense of satisfaction. Justice had been served, but more importantly, they had helped create something positive from Harold's negativity. Pine Valley was now a genuine community where neighbors looked out for each other instead of living in fear. The woman who had once faced down 3 fake police officers on her doorstep had done something even more significant. She had helped transform a neighborhood, ruled by fear, into a community built on mutual respect and genuine care for one another. Harold Patterson's legacy would be a federal prison sentence and a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked power. But Lisa and Tom's legacy would be a stronger, healthier community where future Harold Pattersons would never be able to take root.